Hi. In this module, we are going to be dealing with the 17th century, and we're first going to deal with the Counter-Reformation movement and absolutism in this module. So we left off where Henry IV has become King of France, and he was raised Protestant, but he accepted to be crowned and as a Catholic because to become King of France, the ceremony had to be done in a Catholic cathedral and had to be done by the Pope. So to become King of France, he became Catholic and went along with that idea, which is where the saying that Paris is well worth a mass comes from. So we're going to take a look at this this new dichotomy and this new struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism. So we begin with the Counter-Reformation movement in the 17th century. And the illustration that you see there on the right is an illustration of the Council of Trent, which happened during mid-16th century. But will come into play here in the struggle between Catholics and Protestants. So let's talk a little bit about the Counter-Reformation movement. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated by Catholic fanatics. So that put an end to his reign. And also kind of sparked a lot of anti-Protestant sentiments. So the person who takes over from Henry IV is Louis XIII. So now we're going to be going through a bunch of Louis until basically there are no more Louis to go through. So he was a Catholic. He saw the Virgin Mary as being his kind of emblem, if you will. He also married Anne of Austria, who's the daughter of the King of Spain. And if you recall from the last module, Spain was a very Catholic country. This is going to lead to some issues between these different religions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Louis XIII in the next slide. So the person who succeeds Louis XIII is Louis XIV, who might be the most famous French king. And Louis XIV is also very Catholic, probably even more Catholic than his father. And he is responsible for the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revokes the Edict of Nantes. And if you recall, the Edict of Nantes was set up by Henry IV, who it established the right for Protestants to worship in certain areas at certain times. And so Louis XIV wanted to do away with that and managed to get the Edict of Fontainebleau, which did away with the Edict of Nantes. So he wanted France to basically be a Catholic state and nothing else. So let's look at what Louis XIII had to do with religion. So, like I said, he was devoutly Catholic. And was not in favor of Protestants. And if you remember from the last module, Protestants in France were called Huguenots or Calvinists. So he decided to more strictly enforce the Edict of Nantes. And there was an area in central France where Protestants were felt a little bit more freedom to worship as they wanted to. So what he did is he strictly enforced the edict in that area. So this was actually restricting their religious freedoms. So It kind of came to a head in a town called La Rochelle in 1628. And what happened was that there was a siege at the town, and the king surrounded the town and did not allow any food to go through. So the town went from about 30,000 inhabitants to 6,000. So he starved most of the population of that town. Now, following that terrible, uh, basically a massacre, pretty much, if you will, a long-term massacre, they did resolve it with the Peace of Alais in 1629, which reestablished the freedom to worship, but with greater restrictions. So what this ended up doing was that the Protestants were grateful for this so-called peace, and they became more loyal to the king, which served the king pretty handily, because at that time France was still the number one enemy of England. And England had helped the inhabitants of the town of La Rochelle, but to no avail. So now the King of France has on his side the Protestants, which he had formerly attacked, but now they're actually turning against the British. So it served to the king's advantage. So the political threat that the Protestants had posed is now neutralized. And in the meantime, although it appears that the Protestants are being somewhat given the freedom to worship, in the meantime, or at the same time, there are movements to further fortify Catholicism. And this is kind of where the Council of Trent comes in. So the Council of Trent keeps strengthening the Catholic position, and they keep kind of building the Catholic tenets around anti-Protestantism. So although on the surface it appears as though the Protestants have a chance, really below the surface, the Catholics are still actively working to fortify the Catholic position and to build a Catholic state. So now we're going to go ahead and go to Louis XIV, who was even more strongly opposed to Protestantism than Louis XIII. So Louis XIV is an interesting character. He became king at the age of 4, basically. His father died when he was 4, so then in name he became king, but really his mother was looking after the kingdom. He ruled for 72 years, the longest period of time a monarch has ruled. He built the Palace of Versailles, which you probably are all familiar with. It's a beautiful palace with wonderful gardens and a room that is filled with mirrors. So if you get a chance, you should definitely go and visit Versailles. And he spent much of his life there. He was a big fan of ballet. He actually would dance ballet, and as you see in the illustration there, it's a representation of the king himself dancing ballet. And he was nicknamed the Sun King. And there he kind of looks like he is a sun. And there are different theories as to why he was named the Sun King. The one I kind of espouse is the one where basically France revolved around him. He was not necessarily somebody who was willing to share power, and he was kind of somebody who was a little bitter about some of the things he suffered in life and the way people treated him, and he could hold a grudge. He was somewhat neglected by his mother and grew up with servants, and at some point there was a rebellion, and he and his family were chased out of Paris, and that was called La Fronde. And he never quite forgot that because the nobility was against him, and he never forgave the nobility for their disrespect and their disloyalty. So he was a man who had a hard time trusting others, but an interesting figure in French history and one that is very often talked about. So what he managed to do, though, is, he hated Protestants. So he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which gave freedom of worship to the Protestants in specified areas and at specified times. He revoked it and put in its place the Edict of Fontainebleau. And what that means is basically there is only one religion, and it's Catholicism. So any other religion is considered heresy. So I have a little video here. It's a 3-minute video clip about Louis XIV.
Came from the age of 4, Louis XIV would become one of the most famous and longest-reigning monarchs in French history.
And of Austria, whose Louis XIV's mother nominally ran the country, while he was a small boy. But there was a man named Mazarin, who really had the reins of government. He was kind of a despot, and he was very manipulative.
When Louis was 9, an uprising called Le Fronde forced him to flee from Paris. Le Fronde ended in 1653, and Louis was crowned in 1654.
Louis never really forgave the nobility who rebelled against the crown. He chose to live outside of Paris most of his reign. He was determined to take traditional powers away from the nobility in France.
In 1660, Louis XIV married Marie Theresa of Spain.
Louis treated the Queen with politeness, even an exaggerated respect due to a daughter of the King of Spain. He also kept mistresses quite openly.
In 1661, Louis's longtime advisor Mazarin died, and rather than appoint a new first minister, Louis shocked France by taking personal control of the government, centralizing the legal system and military. Using French manufacturers and architects, Louis began to build the extravagant Palace of Versailles. But the greater drain on France's treasury was Louis's hunger for war.
On his deathbed, Louis XIV told his great-grandson and successor, the future Louis XV, that he had made war too lightly and too much for his own vanity.
In 1685, Catholic Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had permitted Protestants to openly practice their faith.
Several hundred thousand French Protestants and Huguenots left France, and this was both economically and culturally devastating for France in the long run.
In 1700, Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was named the heir to the Spanish throne. Philip was also second in line of succession for the French crown.
All of Europe was worried that Spain, with its huge global empire, was going to become united politically to France, the most powerful country militarily in Europe, creating a power that would be completely irresistible.
The War of the Spanish Succession threw the country deeply into debt. After 13 years of fighting, Philip renounced his claim to the French crown and ended the war. Louis had 4 more heirs for the throne, but only one would survive him.
He thought he was leading this dynasty of boys that could take over from him, one by one. Smallpox, measles, or as I like to say, killed by doctors, which is the reality of the case.
Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, leaving the crown to his great-great-grandson.
I think Louis XIV should be remembered as a tragic figure. Somebody who, through his early love for war, left France broken, exhausted, and bankrupt.
So a couple things to point out from this video. Number one is that revoking the Edict of Nantes and setting in its place the Edict of Fontainebleau, Louis might have thought that the Protestants would convert to Catholicism, but instead what ended up happening is that about a quarter of the Protestants living in France, about 200,000 to 250,000, ended up leaving. And these people were not unskilled people. These were very skilled people. So just imagine a mass exodus of doctors and lawyers and professors and, leaving the country. So it kind of left a void. And the other thing that happened from that, too, is that the Protestants kind of went underground. So they didn't disappear, but they went underground. And also they're going to come back and have somewhat of a guerrilla warfare going on with the French government, which was called les camisards. And then the other thing to remember is at the end it was mentioned that one of the people who was possible successor to Louis XIV was Philip of Anjou, and Philip of Anjou was King of Spain, which meant that if he gets the throne to France, France becomes, so now it would be the Kingdom of France and Spain, and he would just have enormous power. So Louis XIV did not want that. That was something that was not desirable, and so France enters into a period of war, heavy war, called the War of Succession, which drains France of a lot of capital. So we'll talk about that a little further down the road, but just to point those two things out. And also, Louis XIV's wife was one of his cousins, and that might explain perhaps how many mistresses he had, but he had children by her, as it was his royal duty, but he did have mistresses, and he had children with those mistresses as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what was going on with Louis XIII and Louis XIV. So their reigns are, Louis XIV's reign is a continuation of Louis XIII's reign, but in an exaggerated fashion in some ways. So there are two instrumental people around Louis XIII and Louis XIV, and the first one of these is Richelieu. And Richelieu was a cardinal, and he was a close advisor to the king. And he was instrumental in kind of encouraging the king to have fewer ministers and fewer advisors, and rely just on a small number of people to govern. And so Richelieu advised Louis XIII, and also helped educate Louis XIV when he was a small boy. So we have Louis XIII and Louis XIV who are being advised and educated by Richelieu, a cardinal. And Richelieu has a mentee, so he's a mentor to somebody else. And his mentee is Mazarin. And Mazarin takes the reins from Richelieu and acts as an advisor to Louis XIV, and continues down the path of limiting the number of people around the king who have influence on the king. That way, much of the influence is given to these cardinals. So in this way, we're moving towards this idea of absolutism, and where few people have the power, but they have a lot of power. So under Louis XIII, as I mentioned, it's increased power to a small number of ministers. But under Louis XIV, who you can see illustrated here, there's increased power to the monarch. Louis XIV decides that he does not need ministers. He is his own best advisor. So Louis XIV was really just embraced the idea of absolutism. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I also wanted to talk about the other things that were going on at the time. So one of the good things that was going on was that there was an increase in hospitals. So there was an increase in care being given to the sick and to the poor. Along with that, increased social care, and also increased education, meaning more people were being educated than before. And a lot of this had to do with Catholicism. So if you remember, there's an anti-Protestant movement. All right, so we're in the age of Counter-Reformation, which was a pushback against allowing Protestants to worship somewhat freely. So the pushback, some of it involved increasing the good deeds of the Catholic Church. And what they started to do is they increased the number of seminaries and people being trained in the Catholic faith. And the people who had been trained and became priests would be sent out to smaller, less populated areas. And they would kind of act as the moral chief, if you will, the moral judge for that area. And they would also want the citizens to be good moral Christians, but also submit to the state. So they kind of held an administrative role and just a role of checking in on the population at large. And they did this through social deeds and also through education. Now, some of the bad things that were going on at the time was that there was increased intolerance. So, yes, there was more care given, but at the same time, if you did not fit the mold, if you were not a good Catholic, if you were not what was considered moral, so let's say you were a prostitute or Jewish or something like that, you might be confined. You might be imprisoned for not following the moral guidelines of society. So you see an increased intolerance for people who do not have the set of beliefs that was in a way dictated by the church and the state. Now, another bad thing, as you can imagine, since we're living in an age where there are fewer people with much more power, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we can see increased corruption in the government, people vying for favors, people were able to buy offices if they had that type of money. And also we're seeing increased taxation on the population. And as I mentioned, you could buy an office, and some offices were bought just to avoid taxation because some offices came with the privilege of not having to pay taxes. So some people were being taxed more, whereas others were not being taxed at all because they were able to buy certain privileges. It's also a time of war. We have the War of Succession. We have the 30-Year War, which was basically started as a religious war, Protestant versus Catholic, but ended up as a war, France versus the Habsburgs. And these are very expensive wars. We're now paying mercenaries, full-on armies to fight these wars, and the costs are exorbitant. So the population is being taxed for these things, and also they're being taxed because the rich and the nobility and the monarchy want to continue this completely lavish lifestyle. One of the things that was apparent from one of the concrete objects that comes out of that era of time is the Palace of Versailles. So Versailles was built by Louis XIV, and it was built away from Paris, so away from the people, away from most of the politicians, and it was just his little enclave, and it's completely lush and lavish, and he had water brought in to fill in the fountains, and there are thousands of fountains. I mean, it's an incredible property. So anyway, he had this palace built away from Paris. So you can imagine just if a politician is completely isolated from its people, his or her people, they kind of tend to live in their little bubble. And that can lead to something interesting. So one of the things was that if you wanted to speak to the king, you had to be at Versailles. So a lot of the nobility ended up moving into Versailles. And this created this strange little world where Louis XIV was the center of the universe. He is the Sun King, and he liked the idea of it, and he liked to embody it in as many ways as possible, so everything revolved around him. And one of these, the stranger parts was the morning rituals. So every morning when the king would wake up, there would be a number of nobles waiting on him, and it kind of delineated some form of hierarchy, which duty you were allowed to do. So let's say one nobleman might put his gloves on, another one might put his hat on. There were even some bathroom attendants for him, and all this was done to curry favor from the king, and it also sent a signal to the other people in the palace of who had the most influence or the most rewards from the king. So every morning this would go on with Louis XIV and his strange rituals. Now, if Louis XIV had died at a younger age, he might have left a legacy that would have been considered somewhat positive. But he did live until in his 70s. So what he left behind was a bankrupt nation. He had gone to war. He had built this palace, and he kind of left France in a bad spot. And we might realize this since by the time Louis XVI is in power, France is very unhappy with this situation. So we're only 2 kings away from the French Revolution. So obviously these things happen over time. They don't happen overnight. So Louis XIV played a part in this. So while this is going on, while Louis XIV is living in his bubble and being courted by people in the palace and just enjoying his life to the fullest with his mistresses and his abundance of food and riches and gold. At the same time, there's another current going on at the time, and this is the Age of Enlightenment. So what's going on here is that the intellectual elite is meeting, and they are discussing things. So here you have a picture, an illustration of what one of those meetings might have looked like. And these meetings would occur in rich ladies' living rooms. And salon is the French word for living room. So a group of artists, writers, philosophers, scientists, what have you, would gather in these living rooms, and they would speak of the condition of man. And they started to want to trust not the state and not the church. They wanted to figure out how to use a more logical and reasoned approach towards things. So at this time in England, you have Francis Bacon, who comes up with the scientific method. You have Descartes, who was a mathematician, a French mathematician, and he's known for the saying, I think, therefore I am. You have Rousseau, and you have these people who start discussing not only science, but also the condition of man, and discussing what it means to be human, and why should some have so much more than others. And so this is leading up to the revolution, and they have this idea that that every man is equal, and every man should have the same say, right? So we have this idea of democracy, and we also have the rights of man. So you have this idea that certain things should not be done to man, or man should not do certain things. So they start discussing these sorts of ideas, and they're doing it somewhat in secret. But this is where we leave off for this module. And in the next module, we'll start with the revolution. So I encourage you to take a look at the Age of Enlightenment, and also the life of Louis XIV, because it is fairly fascinating. And the next time we meet, we will talk about the French Revolution. Thank you.